Well, greetings, everyone. It's time for our sixth installment of our Sunday School Snippets, working our way through the book of Micah. And today we're going to be in the back part of Micah, Micah chapter 5, verses 10 through 15. And the past two installments, we've taken a look at this wonderful prophecy at the very beginning of Micah chapter 5 of a ruler to be born in Bethlehem. And then last go around, in the middle of Micah chapter 5, we looked at the great promise of a remnant. This go around, we're going to take a look at this turn towards judgment that takes place in the last few verses. So I'm going to put the passage up on the screen, and then we'll make a few comments about it as we work our way through it. So let's take a look. Micah chapter 5, verses 10 through 15. And in that day, declares the Lord, I will cut off your horses from among you, and will destroy your chariots. And I will cut off the cities of your land, and throw down all your strongholds. And I will cut off sorceries from your hand, and you shall have no more tellers of fortunes. And I will cut off your carved images and your pillars from among you, and you shall bow down no more to the work of your hands. And I will root out your Asherah images from among you, and destroy your cities. And in anger and wrath I will execute vengeance on the nations that did not obey. Well, that's a heavy passage, of course. And before we sort of look at it in a broad sense, let's just make a couple observations about a few key findings from the text itself. First off, you notice that God is declaring, in many respects, an end to the military operations of Israel. He talks about how he's going to cut off their horses. He's going to destroy their chariots. He's going to cut off the cities of the land. And of course, when both the Assyrians and the Babylonians rolled through the northern and southern kingdoms, their superior military forces destroyed the far inferior forces of the Israelites. And so, on the one hand, you sort of have this military judgment that is in view here. But as we've already seen in the book of Micah, particularly in the first couple of chapters, which seems like ages ago now, there's this very important focus that Micah places on the religious heart of the people of God. And we saw that earlier in Micah, and we see it here as well, especially in verses 12 and following. Notice what Micah says, I will cut off sorceries from your hand. You will no longer have tellers of fortune. A sad reality of Israel in its day is that they were leaning on necromancing and all kinds of pagan practices instead of leaning on the very prophets of God himself. Not unlike our temptation as Christians today to dabble in those kinds of things, occult kinds of practices, Ouija boards, tarot cards, astrology, and that kind of thing. God says, I'm going to put an end to that kind of thing. But what I find particularly convicting is verses 13 and following, where God says, I will cut off your carved images and your pillars, and you shall, note this, you shall bow down no more to the work of your hands. If you've read the Old Testament, particularly in, say, First Kings, Second Kings, portions of the Chronicles, and so forth, one of the recurring sin patterns of Israel is the temptation to worship idols, carved images, wooden poles that they would put on hilltops and go and do all kinds of pagan festivities and other kinds of practices around them. But we're not much different today. How often do our hearts create idols of our own making? And this could be work, this could be a whole variety of different things. It could be money, could be health, safety, security, these things that we think we make with our own hands, and in our hearts we bow down to them. So Micah's message here, this warning about false worship, worshiping things that we make, really goes back all the way to Genesis, goes to something deep in our hearts where we're wired to worship, and so often what happens to our worship is that it gets polluted and perverted by things of our own design, which then brings, in verse 15, the vengeance of God. Now, sort of stepping back, you may be wondering, what has happened here? Because if you were following along the first bit of Micah chapter 5, it all seemed pretty happy. As you see up here in your top right corner, there was the promise of a ruler from Bethlehem, this wonderful anticipation of Jesus being born in Bethlehem and all that that meant. And then there was this beautiful promise, this lovely good news about a remnant. And so why has all of a sudden Micah's message turned to judgment? Why is that? Well, one of the things that the prophets help us realize is that we need to have a kind of balanced view of what the good news of both the Old Testament and the New Testament really is. And I find it so interesting. We've been in Romans, as you know, in the sermon series, and several weeks ago, as we were working through Romans 1, one of the key themes in Romans 1 is that the gospel starts in the Old Testament. Paul says the gospel he's proclaiming was pre-promised in the Old Testament. He's consistent with the Old Testament gospel, although it's come to its true fruition in Jesus. And one of the things that he mentions in Romans 1 is that the gospel actually is a two-edged sword. So often in modern Christianity, we only want to focus on the good news, the warm fuzzies that we get. Jesus as our homeboy, the sort of good news of God loves you, pursues you, he's your friend, and that kind of thing. And in many respects, a lot of that is true. But what Micah reminds us, and what actually the New Testament reminds us, is that God is also a holy God. We actually see this pattern even in Romans 1. In the sort of thematic section here in Romans 1, Paul says, look, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. So there's our word that we know and love. He says, all right, the great thing about that is the power of God for salvation, and in it, the righteousness of God is revealed. And so many Christians stop there and say, look, the gospel is good news, God pursuing you. But Paul balances it out in the very next verse, in verse 18. In fact, he says, in it, that is the gospel, not only is the righteousness of God revealed, but so also the wrath of God is revealed. It's a sobering truth that Micah 5 reminds us of here. And it's simply this, that you can't have a one-sided gospel. The gospel, if it's true, has to include both the promise of God's love and his goodness, but also a reminder of our sin, a reminder that God takes sin seriously, a reminder that God is ultimately and infinitely righteous and holy. And so it's helpful to be reminded that there has to be, in some respects, the bad news of the gospel for the good news of the gospel to make sense. And I think Micah chapter 5 reminds us of that. It gives us this wonderful promise of Christ as the one who is coming from Bethlehem to rule. It gives us this promise that God is pursuing a remnant of the righteous, of the faithful that are his. Also reminds us, however, that God is a wrathful God who takes vengeance on evildoers. And the good news of the gospel is that that would have been us if not for this very ruler from Bethlehem who takes that wrath for us. So let Micah chapter 5 in its entirety remind us of both the good and the bad news of the good news, that we were lost. We were under God's wrath, as Paul says in Ephesians and elsewhere. But by the work of Christ, that ruler from Bethlehem, we have now come into the grace, the goodness of God as he preserves us as his remnant. So praise be to God for that glorious truth.